So with that, I do want to just encourage you. I know that this year and a half has been challenging in many ways with COVID and the fire service, with how COVID has impacted your communities and how it's impacted mine as well. But now I'm sitting here in Kenya with some of you, although we're not together. And I'm just conscious of the ways that some of you and your families, the losses that you've had, and the economic losses that have happened across Africa as a result of COVID. And so I just want to encourage you all to stay the course, to look for strength in maybe a faith. For me, that's in my Christian faith. I encourage you to look for that if that's something that you want to talk about. AFM's here to talk about that as well. But I just want to encourage you to connect with each other and seek support from each other. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Deputy Chief McAfee. I can't talk this afternoon. And he's going to take us through a training on aircraft hazards. So thanks so much for joining us today once again.
Yeah, welcome. Thank you so much. It's a pretty amazing opportunity on my end, so I appreciate that, and I appreciate everyone on the training today. So thank you for your commitment to wanting to get better for your communities, and I'm humbled that I have the opportunity to share some information with you. So I'm just appreciative of that. Good morning for me. As I think it's afternoon for you, correct? Is it afternoon? Okay, so correct. I will be my version of tea, which is coffee today. Okay. To keep myself going. Today we're going to talk about aircraft hazards, training and integrated mutual aid response. And when we talk about mutual aid response, the definition of mutual aid response that I'm using is, we'll keep it basic, is just anytime you're helping a partner agency. So if you have another fire department or another agency or another village or whatever the case may be, anytime you're helping another in a fire service capacity, we would call that mutual aid response in the United States. So that's what that means as we work towards this. So this is all about helping each other. When you have an incident in your area and you're not familiar with aircraft or aircraft hazards, or an aircraft crashes outside of an airport or some type of off-field runway, the people that are helping you deal with that emergency know what they're doing. So that was the intent of this program, and that's why I built this program. So once again, Nancy, thank you for the introduction. My name is Jacob McAfee, Deputy Fire Chief. I work at a fire protection district in United States, California. I've been in the fire service about 21 years. I've worked at all levels of government right now, obviously local government. I've worked with the Department of Defense here in the United States. I've worked in multiple states, Arizona, New York, New Jersey, and California. And I worked in all the different capacities. So I've served in every fire service division. I've been a training officer, prevention, been a fire chief at other organizations, and in my current position here. Most of my time in the fire service, I've had aircraft rescue firefighting responsibilities at some pretty major airfields, dealing mainly with dual airports. So airports that have a military aircraft mission and a civilian aircraft mission. And so as we get through this presentation, if I can get my slides to move, as we get through this presentation, what you'll find is that much of the information geared towards aircraft hazards is going to be a little bit specific to military aircraft, but that's okay, because most of those hazards are still similar to any type of civilian aircraft you're going to deal with outside of course, you know, ordnance and rockets and bombs and guns and those type of things. But you'll see some of that today. Just keep in mind, this is just, you know, informational. If it applies to you, great. If it doesn't, I would encourage you just to think about what type of hazards that may be similar in some of the environments that you work in that apply to you for those concepts. So We'll go ahead and get started. So I appreciate it. Framework. Oh. Nancy, you wanna say something?
No, there's someone who, I'm trying to figure out where that's coming from. I'm not sure. I think we've got them on mute now, though. I think we're good.
Okay, just making sure. All right, so the framework of this presentation, when I put it together, was based on what I talked about in the beginning of helping another agency or agencies helping you. Because at the end of the day, when we have big disasters, we need to rely on each other. And so that can't just happen organically. We have to be able to understand how do we best help each other. So that CMAR acronym there stands for Collaborative Mutual Aid Response. All right, so the collaborative part obviously is working with our partners, and the mutual aid is who we help, and then figuring out what type of response we're going to assist with. And so when we talk about having an effective collaborative mutual aid response, for me, I think there's 4 major concepts that we have to make sure that we understand and work to gain competency in. Those 4 major concepts here are kind of around this central circle here. So SA is situational awareness. Obviously that second top right component, training, is kind of the backbone to everything we do, right? I mean, in order to perform on the fire ground, we have to be able to schedule and perform efficient training, so we are successful in the real world. Pre-fire planning, that's pre-fire planning of your jurisdiction, your area, your airport, and pre-fire planning of the aircraft that you may encounter or that you may have at your stationed airport if you're doing aircraft rescue firefighting. And then the last one is mutual aid R&R. So R&R is resources and response. So if you're going to get help from someone, what equipment, what apparatus, what type of personnel, what type of training, what type of things resource-wise can you get from them to help you mitigate your emergency? And what does that look like? How do you operate it? How are you going to apply it? How is it going to help your situation? And the last one is the response. What are they coming with? What are they bringing to the party per se? Right. And so understanding that's going to help us in that collaborative mutual aid response theory, mitigate any emergency we should have. Right. So some of the things we're going to try to focus on today is understanding hazards with a focus, obviously, like I talked about in the beginning, on specialty and military aircraft. Recognize factors that improve situational awareness regarding aircraft rescue firefighting and aircraft rescue firefighting incidents. Understand the basic ARF training components. So, if training is one of those key cogs, and you're a new training officer or you're new to ARF, where are some resources or references that you can use to develop your training program, right? And what are some of those components to that? Describe basic aircraft pre-fire plan components. So when I'm talking about pre-fire planning, I'm talking about what do we have informationally available to us that we can understand the hazards posed by aircraft that we respond to in event of emergency. That's everything from how do we approach it to, what material hazards are on there, how many people it carries, how much fuel it carries, how do we access it. That's what I'm talking about in regards to aircraft pre-fire plans, and we'll go over that. And then appraise and develop a collaborative mutual aid response framework. So if we're going to work with another agency, what are some factors or considerations that we need to evaluate to make sure that we will work well together? If we were to put some stuff on the board and say, hey, these are the most important things that we both need to understand about each other to work the best together, what would they be? And those are some of the components that we're going to talk about. All right, so I'm going to start off with a little video. For me, it's 5 a.m. So I need a little bit of something to break this up, a little bit of humor per se, right? So I'm going to play this little video, and this is a maritime video. So we're talking about aviation right now, right? We're going to be talking about aircraft rescue firefighting, and the title, the bar is set very low. I think you'll kind of get where I'm going with the video, but if we can just strive to be better than the maritime field in regards to this video, I think we're going to be okay. So I'm going to play this video, and if you, for some reason, you can't hear it or see it, and it's not a connection issue, just do something in the chat or let Nancy know, and I'll try to fix it on my end. But let me play this video here.
Senator Collins, thanks for coming in.
It's a great pleasure, thank you.
This ship that was involved in the incident off Western Australia this week.
Yeah, the one the front fell off?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not very typical. I'd like to make that point.
Well, how is it untypical?
Well, there are a lot of these ships going around the world all the time, and very seldom does anything like this happen. I just don't want people thinking that tankers aren't safe.
Was this tanker safe?
Well, I was thinking more about the other ones.
The ones that are safe?
Yeah, the ones the front doesn't fall off.
Well, if this wasn't safe, why did it have 80,000 tonnes of oil on it?
Well, I'm not saying it wasn't safe. It's just perhaps not quite as safe as some of the other ones.
Why?
Well, some of them are built so the front doesn't fall off at all.
Well, wasn't this built so the front wouldn't fall off?
Well, obviously not.
How do you know?
Well, because the front fell off and 20,000 tonnes of crude oil spilled into the sea caught fire. It's a bit of a giveaway. I just like to make the point that that is not normal.
Well, what sort of standards are these oil tankers built to?
Oh, very rigorous maritime engineering standards.
What sort of thing?
Well, the front's not supposed to fall off for a start.
And what other things?
Well, there are regulations governing the materials that they can be made of.
What materials?
Well, cardboard's out.
And?
No cardboard derivatives.
Like paper?
No paper. No string, no sellotape.
Rubber?
No, rubber's out. They've got to have a steering wheel. There's a minimum crew requirement.
What's the minimum crew?
Oh, one, I suppose.
So the allegations that they're just designed to carry as much oil as possible, all the
ludicrous.
consequences, I mean, that's ludicrous.
Absolutely ludicrous. These are very, very strong vessels.
So what happened in this case?
Well, the front fell off in this case, by all means, but it's very...
All right. So obviously there, if the bar is making ships of cardboard and making sure the front doesn't fall off, if that's the bar, I think we can definitely improve on that, right? I found that video a while ago, and I just watch it sometimes because I think it's pretty funny. So I think in the aviation industry or aircraft rescue firefighting, I think we can do better. All right. So it's something to break.
Unusual.
But Senator Collins, why did the front book fall off?
Well,
All right. There we go. All right. So some historical context, and this is just regarding the presentation itself. Okay. So once again, most of my career, if not the majority of it, has been spent in aircraft rescue firefighting. And as a matter of fact, if you take all the firefighting skill sets or fields, you know, structural firefighting, aircraft, hazmat, rescue, all those things, I would probably put aircraft rescue firefighting up towards the top of my favorite competencies or fields. I've just enjoyed it. I've been at pretty busy airfields, been able to experience quite a different incident responses and things like that, to where it just really caught my interest for a long time. So what I noticed in my career is that I worked on some pretty busy airfields, but every time we had a major incident, or every time we had a significant crash or something like that, a lot of the time they were off base or off airport. Right, so we'd get a call of a military aircraft or civilian aircraft that had crashed, but it didn't crash during landing. It crashed before it got to the airport, and so we're responding outside of the airport. And I'll talk about why that's in a second. But this is just this historical context on why I developed this presentation regarding collaborative mutual aid. So these are just a couple historical points in time of military aircraft incidents here in the United States that happened off the airport. All right, so one's 2005. It's a Harrier. Another military aircraft crashed in Yuma, Arizona, is one of the places I've worked. You know, it's obviously in the middle of a residential area. So there's a Harrier, it has an in-flight emergency. It can't make it back to the airfield. It has some 500-pound bombs, has a bunch of ammunition, has plenty of fuel, and all the hazards we're going to talk about, and it ends up crashing in a residential neighborhood, right? You know, so once it does that, it poses a lot of different challenges, you know, to responders, right? 2007, we had an F-18 Super Hornet, another military attack aircraft, crashed into another neighborhood again in South Carolina. 2008, another F-18 crashed in California outside Miramar. That was into another residential neighborhood. 2009, F-22, which is that fifth generation fighter for the United States, crashes in another location off airport in California. P-3 Orion crashes in Florida right through the roof of a residential home. And these last two, same type of thing, just outside the airport. Another F-18 crash, another helicopter crash during training. Once again, all off the airfield. So what that means is that, oops, sorry, apologies. What that means is that when these things happen, at least from my experience, a lot of time it's off the airport. So the concept of collaborative mutual aid means that we know that many times it may not be an ARF response that's going to get to that aircraft incident before we do. It may be some of our partners. It may be someone in another agency, another jurisdiction, another town, another village, another state, whatever the case may be. It may be somewhere else that we have to respond to, and we're going to get there a little late. So if we know that ahead of time, and we know certain partners are in that sphere of influence or that zone that they have the ability to possibly respond to one of these incidents, those people need to know the hazards. They need to know the strategies and the tactics in order to be able to deal with those, because you can't just deal with it the same as a structure fire, because it's not the same. Okay, so that's the collaborative mutual aid part, is why I developed this, is because we have this happening. And many times we get on scene and the first responders that are just trained as structural firefighters, let's just say, have no idea to handle a military aircraft or the hazards that it poses, or that it even carries bombs, and how, what's the distance for evacuation, they don't know any of that. And so it was really important for us to, at least from my perspective, to train them on certain aspects of that, so they're safe, and then we can work together to help mitigate that incident. So this is just an example of one of those F-18 crashes that was into a residential neighborhood. We're gonna take a look at this real quick.
The F-18 Hornet exploded into flames in a residential area near a school and busy freeway. At least 2 people were killed on the ground.
There might have been a grandmother and a mother and 2 children at home, but we only have 2 confirmed right now.
Neighbors were rushed out of homes as the fire grew.
I just heard the big explosion, and then just flames going all over the place.
Witnesses turned to the skies when they heard the jet was in trouble. Military officials blame a mechanical malfunction.
I heard and saw the pilot eject and the aircraft go down. My next move was to find the pilot,
who had been trying to land at Miramar Marine Air Station just 2 miles away.
I found him, and he came down into a tree in a residential area.
The pilot was taken to a nearby hospital. The F-18 Hornet has long been the workhorse of the Navy and Marines since its design in the 1970s. However, all F-18 models were recently grounded after cracks were found on a hinge in the aircraft. Only a small number were found to have similar cracks. The rest returned to the air. The pilot in this crash was just returning from a training mission on an aircraft carrier in the Pacific. Sandra Hughes, CBS News, Los Angeles.
All right. So once again, it happens, right? It happens many times off the airport. Oops. All right. So like I said, what we're going to talk about today, first, we had our 4 major components of collaborative mutual aid response. That one component, the first component we're going to talk about, that top left in our initial pictures, is situational awareness. So what that means, at least to me, is, are we aware of the hazards that aircrafts pose to us as firefighters and to the civilians or the people in the communities that we protect? And if we are aware of them, do we know how to deal with those hazards strategically? So how does it affect our decisions to mitigate that incident or protect the population at large, right? And so in order for us to make those decisions, we have to know those things. We have to be aware of some of the hazards that they pose. All right, so a part of situational awareness is just being familiar with the hazards associated with aircraft. Now, once again, this is geared towards military aircraft, but I would encourage you just to think for yourself and just do some critical thinking. And if you haven't already, any aircraft that you can come in contact with, period, you should know these same hazards, right? And if you know those same hazards on those aircraft, all of this applies, right? That situational awareness concept applies. So regarding military aircraft, fighter and attack aircraft, most of the times they're designed for air-to-air, air-to-ground combat. The reason that's important is because it's going to tell you a little bit about their design. It's going to tell you a little bit about what they may be carrying regarding ordnance, ammunition, large rockets or bombs, and it'll tell you a little bit about the number of people that aircraft carries, right? Because fighter attack aircraft aren't going to carry a lot of people, right? So just knowing that helps you understand that. AC-130 is attack cargo. So everyone is generally familiar with the C-130. It's kind of the most popular, probably, cargo plane in the world, really. It's a large cargo aircraft, but they can be converted to attack cargo aircraft, right? What that means is, instead of cargo, it has a lot more ammunition, a lot more ordnance, a lot more hazards to firefighters. All right. Obviously, they carry weapons. They have canopies and ejection seats, right? So while they help the pilot, they're in extreme danger to first responders or firefighters, right? So if those canopies and ejection seats use rockets and explosive devices to jettison a projectile, which is the seat, right? The seat or the canopy, well, those projectiles become extreme hazards to us, right? And not every time does a pilot eject. So if a pilot doesn't eject, well, that means that that seat and that canopy are still armed, unless it's in pieces, of course, right? But if it's a hard landing or it's not a full aircraft crash and there's no ejection there, that seat and that canopy are hazards to us because they haven't been ejected. So it still has the same, explosives in there, the same triggers. And so we need to be aware of those and the deployment of those and the hazards of those so we can operate around that aircraft safely. Hazardous materials. All right. So a jet is a big hazmat. So when you looked at those pictures before of something in a residential neighborhood, well, the reason I say it's different than a structure fire is because it is. Now, when it's in pieces, does it make it a little easier that the majority of your hazard is buildings on fire? Sure, from a structural standpoint. But now you have fuel, right? So you have pool fires, possibly. You have 3D fuel fires instead of Class A combustibles burning or, a structure fire. So, different firefighting agents such as AFFF or foam, are going to be more effective than Class A foam or water, which we typically use on structure fires, right? So that's going to change our what we need. Now, a lot of structural engines don't carry AFFF, right? They don't carry aircraft rescue firefighting foam. They just carry Class A foam. So do you need that? What the materials, the fuel is technically a hazmat. The radars, right, have radiation hazards. The ordnance, obviously, explosion hazards. The makeup of those aircraft, the composites that they're made of, whether it's boron tungsten or carbon graphite, or some of those things, when those are on fire, those pose serious respiratory issues and physical issues for responders and the public. So if a building's burning and it's let's say it's a legacy construction, it's an older building, you're looking at wood and plastics and those type of things burning. When an aircraft's burning, you're looking at hazardous materials burning. They can cause significant, distress to the public. And so your evacuations, may be bigger. The areas that which it's going to be affected are a lot bigger because that smoke's a lot more hazardous, right? So there's just a bunch of things regarding an aircraft that bring different hazardous materials potential as well, right? And composites, I talked about a couple of those. Most military aircraft has a significant amount of composites, right? So they use those composites because it's high strength to weight ratio. It's really strong, but really light, right? So the two specific ones that military aircraft have a lot are boron tungsten, carbon graphite, and they both pose some different hazards to rescuers and hazards to the public. For example, carbon graphite, it can be carried miles downwind, just like a fire ember, right? And when it does, it can affect electrical equipment. It can cause severe respiratory distress. And so it can cause a little more hazards than just traditional smoke. The boron tungsten, when it breaks down in the aircraft, it can slice through personal protective equipment pretty easily. So it's definitely hazardous. So we need to know the areas of the aircraft that may be on. So if we're operating around that, we know not to handle certain things and so on and so forth. So the situational awareness piece, I think, is pretty critical. We have obviously bombers and some big differences there. Usually they're just bigger, right? Number one, so they carry more people, more fuel. There's more components, more hazmat, more composites. Everything's just a lot more, right? So that we may require more resources. We may require an evacuation area that's a lot larger, right? So that stresses and puts strain on our infrastructure as well, right? If you only have one hospital in your area, the more of something, the higher chances of more people being affected and overloading that EMS emergency medical services system. And obviously they carry large amounts of ordnance as well. Some hazards of some special purpose aircraft, right? You have reconnaissance, command and control aircraft, electronic surveillance, national security type aircraft, so spy planes, those type of things. but they all have similar hazards, right? They're all going to have some type of composite, some type of hazardous metals. They're going to have batteries of certain type, lead acid, different various batteries, lithium batteries that can pose hazards to firefighters. Many of them have specific cutout areas. Radars pose a hazard. While some of these aircraft have specific things that are built-in safety precautions, like, a lot of aircraft, military aircraft, when they land on the runway, the weight of the aircraft on the wheels shut off the guns, shut off the shafts and flares, shuts off the radar. Well, if it's a hard landing and there's no landing gear down, that stuff is not shut off. And we have to know that, right? So we know those are hazards that are different, that are posed to us. So here's just some different helicopters, right? So the different.
Chief, there's a question in the chat that I'll let you look at when you get a chance, just regarding some dangers and things.
Okay. If I can, is it okay, whoever asked, can I just save that for the end?
Yeah, go ahead.
I went over time last.
Yeah, take a look at it at least. I think it'll help influence how you talk about some things. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that.
That's okay. It was just a really good observation in terms of dangers.
Is it the one from Jeff?
From Jeff? Uh-huh.
Okay. I'm just going to go ahead and read this out loud to everybody. I'm sure everybody has seen it, but I'll read it out loud and I'll see if I understand kind of the question, and I'll answer it as best I can, and we'll move on. And hopefully, if I don't, we can have some more discussion about it. So maybe I understand a little bit more at the end, maybe during tea time. All right, so the question says, meaning that a plane or aircraft is in a very dangerous situation when it happens to catch fire. Is it as dangerous as the way we look at fuel tankers? We normally think that, for example, one should not smoke in or close to a fuel tanker. Okay, so I'm trying to see if I know the intent. So obviously, if something's on fire, right, it changes the complexity and changes some of the hazards, right? So I think what you're saying is that, are you asking what the hazards are when it's not on fire, or the hazards presented when it's not on fire? Is that kind of the intent of the question? Or are there still dangers? But if you can clarify that in the chat, that'd be great. And then I can answer that. Okay, yeah, so absolutely. So the reason I was saying that, if it's not a full-on crash and the cockpit is still intact, right, and the ejection seat is still in there, we need to know how to, number one, get the canopy off. Well, some canopies, as you'll see here in a second, have det cord, which is an explosive that shatters the canopy, right? So when the canopy shatters, that provides an open top for the ejection sheet to come out. Well, if we're going to just say, hey, get the saw, let's cut this canopy off, but you don't know there's det cord lined in that canopy and you don't know where to cut, you're going to blow yourself up, right? And that aircraft isn't on fire. It's sitting on the ground, full in one piece. But if you don't know that hazard is there, you're putting yourself at risk. And that was kind of the example of the collaborative mutual aid, is that when they get there first, if there's no fire, it doesn't seem like there's a major emergency. Let's just say that, for some reason they can't get out of the cockpit. Maybe it was a hard landing and there's some stuff that's jarred. And we got guys go up and just start cutting on things they're not supposed to cut on. Just a simple example, the hydraulics in aircraft are usually 3,000 PSI systems, right? You cut through a hydraulic line, that hydraulic line at 3,000 PSI can either significantly damage through that 3,000 PSI liquid, cutting possibly fingers or limbs off, or significantly cutting your skin, right? So those are just small examples, but I think it drives home the point that there are a lot of different things on aircraft that can pose a different danger. And the situational awareness piece is knowing that if you go up to an aircraft, how do I safety that ejection seat? Once I get the canopy off, you have handles and levers and all these things these pilots use. If you just reach in and grab that guy, if you accidentally pull a pull handle that jettisons his seat, well, guess what? You're going with it, right? You can't just do that. You have to know how to operate around those hazards, right? So there's certain ways to safety them. There are things you can cut. There's all these different things. that disable that. But if you don't know that that's even a hazard, that's a problem, right? So that's an example. And we could talk about a bunch of, there's so many, honestly. I know I only have an hour, but I hope that answered your question. And I'll try as we go through and towards the end, I'm more than happy to elaborate on that a little bit more. But yeah, I would argue that there's more hazards when the aircraft is not on fire. So like the F-18 video I showed you, well, most of the hazards have been reduced to just fire, fuel, and hazmat, right? Because the systems are not working anymore, right? So some of those things that we just talked about, like, hey, there's no hydraulic line, pressure anymore because there's no hydraulic lines, right? There's no seat hazard because there's no seat anymore, right? Canopy's already off, all those things. So while it takes away some, it creates some new ones. And so, yeah, absolutely. There are just as many when it's not on fire. So when you talk about fuel tankers, and those type of things, knowing how much fuel is on there, what type of fuel, right? Because all fuels burn at different temperatures, right? And those are all critically important. So I'm going to move on, but I hope I somewhat answered your question, Jeff. All right. So specifically in regards to that, when we talk about helicopters, right? Now, when a helicopter is on the ground, just as I said, similar hazards, right? They're going to be made out of similar things, similar composites, similar lightweight metals. Helicopters do use hazardous metals. Like a lot of times they use beryllium and magnesium. Some of those metals that catch fire, they really are hard to put out, all right, or are hazardous to us as well. Maybe make us use different strategies or different wetting agents to put out. But obviously here in this case, an attack helicopter is going to carry a lot more ordnance and ammunition. As one example for a helicopter, before I move on specifically, if you look at the picture in the left, I think it's the left for you, which is the attack helicopter. I've been at a ton of emergencies on attack helicopters that have forward facing guns. So they have a big cannon underneath the helicopter, correct? So as an example, and I'm a former Marine. So in the Marine Corps, in the military aspect, we have what's called AH-1 Cobras. That's an Apache for our Army helicopter. Well, that gun has a 180-degree span, right? So it can go 180 degrees to each side of the aircraft. And it's a big cannon. It's a 20-millimeter round. So if that aircraft is still armed and moving when we get on scene, that's a hazard to us, right? So if we don't know that, we can't even park at the nose of the aircraft or position our vehicles at a 45-degree at the nose like we normally would in aircraft rescue firefighting, right? Because that's our traditional position, is it not? Is at 45-degree angles, either at the nose or the rear, depending on where the fire may be. But traditionally at the nose, at a 45 or directly on. Well, if you park anywhere in the front, you're in the range of those 20-millimeter guns. And if it's a hung gun or a problem with the gun, well, now you're positioning an apparatus and people right in front of a live gun. Well, if you don't know that's a hazard, you don't know the 180-degree spin, you're going to park right in the hazard area, right? And so that's an example of a non-fire situational awareness component. So you're going to have to park at the side or the rear, and your approach to the aircraft, to safety of the guns, is going to be from the rear or the side, right? And then when you get there, you're going to know how to safety that gun, right? So that's just an example from the helicopter side, but that's a no fire situation. That's the helicopter lands with some emergency and maybe you have a problem with the gun or what have you. If you're just a normal responder, you don't know that, you're going to walk right up, right? Even more simple, you're going to walk up. How do you walk up for the propellers, right? You got to understand the pitch and the safety zones and all those type of things. So that's just a small example. Hopefully I could drove that home a little bit. Okay, so here's just a couple other pictures of aircrafts, and it's been fun, really, honestly, on the military side to work with all these because you just learn so much. So other hazards, obviously exhausts. When we talk about nozzles, right, not all aircraft have jet engines. Now, this is just specifically in the United States military, but if you look here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that top right aircraft is a V-22 Osprey. That aircraft doesn't have jet engines per se. It has engines in these propeller tips here that have exhaust nozzles. This AV8B Harrier doesn't have jet engines at all. It has 4 nozzles under here that allow it to take off vertically and move. It doesn't have jet engines at all. It's just hot air that comes through there. The obviously has engines, but it's not your traditional, like this F-16 engine here, right? And a different hazard is those Harrier nozzles move. So if you have an emergency and it's not a crash, those nozzles can move. Well, if you're under the aircraft doing something around the aircraft, that exhaust is extremely hot, right? Hot enough to melt asphalt, right? Or make asphalt soft. All right. So if you're not aware those things can move, and how do you prevent that? That's going to be a significant hazard to you. There's just an example. And this other thing is a drogue chute, right? Some aircraft have brake assists. So that parachute is in the back of the aircraft, and if so it doesn't slam on its brakes and cause some type of brake fire, that parachute gets deployed to help slow the aircraft down. Well, if there's some type of hard landing or crash and that hasn't been deployed, well, that's a huge explosive that deploys that chute, and that chute's a projectile. So we have to know that. So when we're walking around the crash site, we want to be able to identify those, mark those, so people don't approach it. Right? Some examples. All right, some other aircraft hazards, right? Hazardous metals, I talked about those, beryllium, magnesium, things that are going to either take a ton of water or different firefighting agents like Lithex or Metalex or something like that to put out. Composite materials, you're going to find those on almost every aircraft, and even civilian aircraft, right? It may just be a different composite material. Fuels, hydraulics, wheel assemblies, APUs and EPUs, those are auxiliary power units or external power units. The reason I put those on there is some military aircraft, they're not powered by a normal system. They're powered by special fuels. As an example, the F-16 in the United States military is powered by what's called H-70, which is hydrazine. Hydrazine is extremely flammable and extremely hazardous to if you breathe it in. And it also burns invisible, right? So we have to know that, and there's certain exhaust points and certain ways to safety that from if you know it's on, it makes a certain sound if it's on. So once again, it goes back to situational awareness, right? Do you know the hazards presented to you on that aircraft, right? Ballistic recovery systems. Most aircraft have what we call the black box, right? So investigators can recover the tape or video or recordings of pilot conversations. Those are protected. Well, at certain G forces and sometimes with water, those are deployed so they don't get destroyed in the crash. Well, they're protected by a significant steel plate that's jettisoned. Well, if you're walking around that steel plate and it jettisons or something happens, you can be significantly injured or killed, as an example. Some other ones, obviously we talked about radar. That FLIR is forward-looking infrared. We have a lot of that on military aircraft. Americium 241, that's part of the radiation hazards from the radar. Batteries pose a hazard, right? You could have overheated batteries, battery fires, some overheated batteries, depending what type of battery is. The off-gassing is a flammable gas. So, it's not just the battery overheating, it's a big deal. It's the flammable gas or flammable vapors that's emitting, right? And we have to know that. How do we cool down batteries? Those type of things. Oxygen systems, we know that oxygen obviously supports combustion, makes it a little difficult on us. Various weapons, I talked about canopies and ejection seats a little bit. And granted, this is only an hour I have with you, right? So most times I have a 4-hour workshop or so on this that we talk about this stuff. All right, so composites, advanced composites, and advanced aerospace materials. We talked about the reasoning behind it, why they use it. It's going to only continue to increase, right? They're not going to go back to making aircraft that weigh significant amounts and, solid steel. Everything they're going to be using is how can we get this thing lighter and faster, right? And when you do that, you have to use different materials, more advanced materials, like we talked about, some advanced composites, right? When that line that says successive NLAs, NLA is new large aircraft. So those are like 777s, right? Or some of these, super aircraft that carry 900 people, right? On the civilian side, right? They're going to continue to do the same thing, right? So you can't carry 900 people and, have enough fuel in it to travel, 15 hours or across the globe without making it extremely light and durable, right? So you got to do that by utilizing some of these things. All right, 2 types of composite fibers. I'm gonna briefly go over this because I talked about it: carbon graphite and boron tungsten. Just something for you to research, but basically they're not a hazard really unless they burn, right? So if it's on fire, that epoxy binder is basically the material that binds the composite fiber, right? So it's almost like a sealant, right? As that burns and as that sealant is degraded and deteriorates at 752 degrees, that's when those materials are released, right? So, you know, obviously under fire that poses different hazards. One of the things I'm just going to harp on is that in order to control those things, generally what in the ARF world, and we would use what's called a wax pack. So during firefighting operations, if we're moving a little bit more towards salvage or trying to protect some of those hazardous materials from getting into the air and traveling down and affecting people, we apply floor wax to it. And we do that because that floor wax lasts, it seals back in that composite fiber, and you know, it reduces the threat to responders and civilians as well. And it's actually literally floor wax. We can use AFFF and some other things, but as we know, AFFF with heat and wind and all those other things will go away, and those hazards will come back. Right? That's why we use wax. Just an example, composites. If you look at one of them's a Harrier that I showed you earlier, one of them F-18. All of these, you know, red and green areas are different types of composites. So if you look at it, the whole aircraft is made out of some type of high strength, lightweight material, some type of composite. So we know that no matter what, there's going to be some type of hazard regarding that. APUs, I talked about a little bit. You know, if the engine goes out or electronics goes out or something, they're used to repower those so they can land safely and those type of things. But they're generally powered with some type of hazardous fuel or other system. And F-16 specifically for us uses that. Just some other examples, guys. I'm going to try to get through this kind of quick because I have a lot of stuff at the end here. Forward-looking infrared, knowing the hazards, where they're located, and how to shut those off if you need to, or how to avoid them if you need to. Viton is another composite material that's stored. Ultimately, when they release, it releases toxic gases when it's exposed to fire, and it also creates a acidic gel. So you get it on your gear, it's an acid on your gear. And so we'll talk about decontamination, but after fires here in the United States, a lot of time we will do what's called a gross decon and wash ourselves down, mainly for cancer reasons, right? For the combustibles that smoke and all that stuff that's on us, carcinogens. But in an aircraft situation, a decon is almost a must, because if you're walking around that wreckage and you have all these things on you, it's not going to be good to leave it off. You know, when you take your face piece off or whatever, you're exposing yourself to that. So decontamination is going to be important. The only thing I'm going to say here is see that canopy, see that cord. If you see that cord that lines in that canopy there, it looks like a cord. That's the deck cord I was talking about when we were talking about cutting a canopy. That is what is used to shatter that canopy. So that's all explosive. That's C4 explosive. Well, if you don't know that and you cut that, it's not a good day for you, right? And so that's what I'm talking about when I talk about situational awareness. And there's an ejection of a seat. Obviously, you know, you can pull those things on accident and get that seat down. Ordnance, we know, is obviously very dangerous to us, right? Mainly what I want you to know is how to approach aircraft with ordnance, if you even approach. And if there is fire, everything just doesn't explode. Generally, based on the damage and the type of ordnance, they have certain time limits at which they do explode. So when we talk about risk versus gain, a lot of times with ordnance, it's like, hey, how far away can we stay, right? And how do we protect everybody else that's in the explosion zone, right? But if you have a significant potential for a rescue in an area with that, and you're armed with some better information, instead of just assuming, you may be able to perform some low risk rescues if you just know what you're getting into, right? So this is just informational. Most everything has a certain cook-off time, whether it's the rocket motor or the warhead. And for me, knowing those is important, whether it's even feasible to try to cool those. All right, that was situational awareness, so aircraft hazards. So I think I'm doing what I did last presentation, talking way too much. And I need to get through this. So pre-fire planning is our next cog in that collaborative mutual aid response, right? And so that's some of these things. So if you're on the airfield, do you know all the critical points on your airfield, either for access, where hazardous things happen, where do aircraft go when they have certain emergencies? Are there areas that you can't talk or can't use radios? You know, what you have to know your airfield. So here's some things that you just need to take into consideration in pre-fire planning. Do you have a hot break area? If an aircraft lands and they have hot breaks, do they go to a certain area? They park at a certain spot, right? Knowing this, maybe reduce your response time to that area, right? Maybe pre-fire planning aircrafts that you generally have problems with. Do they have ordnance loading areas, right? What type of ordnance is there? Hung gun locations. So if they have a problem with the gun or ordnance, they try to drop it. It doesn't drop. When it lands, do they go certain places, right? Areas where you can't use radios. Arresting gear, right? Aircraft has some type of emergency and they take a trap. They put the hook down, catch that arresting gear. Or do you have involvement in that? Do you know how to use the arresting gear? Are there opportunities to use the arresting gear in aircraft rescue firefighting? Absolutely. They'll help us with controlling the aircraft. Do you have crash gates? Do you have certain areas in your airfield where there's gates meant for ARF trucks to drive through and around? We call them crash gates in the United States. But there's specific areas that we know we can drive through that will break away for an aircraft rescue firefighting vehicle to make it to certain locations quicker. If you have those areas, great. Do you know where they are? Do you have underground fire hydrants? A lot of airfields have underground fire hydrants if you do have that type of thing. So the point is pre-fire planning your airfield will make you more efficient, right? Understanding those areas. Last part of the pre-fire planning is with aircraft. So generally, most of the agencies I've been at, we have pre-fire plan books. So any aircraft we run in, we have a pre-fire plan book. And what that does is shows you all the hazards, how we're going to position, how we're going to perform our rescue, all those type of things. So we can continually reference those. And if we have an emergency and it's not an aircraft that we deal with a lot, we can reference those hazards. And it looks like this, honestly. This is a page out of one of them, right? It's color coded for firefighters, right? You know, it has all the things. You don't have to do a lot of reading. You know, you could just look at this and say, hey, here's some hazards. But some of the things you may want to consider in your pre-fire planning for the aircraft is, where do you position your vehicle? What are the responsibilities of people once they get on scene? What are the hazard areas around the aircraft? Kind of like what we talked about, right? Exhausts, radars, maybe ejection seat or canopy ejection areas, you know, anything like that. How many number of passengers and crew? Where are they located? You know, is this an aircraft where it's just people in the cockpit, or they generally have people stored at an upper deck or lower deck? Do people operate in the cargo area, you know, for manifest purposes? You just need to know that. Egress information, there's special equipment. Is there certain cutout areas on the aircraft? How do you open the doors, right? Are there hatches on the top, at the bottom? Where can you access those areas, right? Special equipment, we always did this. If we have some type of landing, we can't get the door open. Some of these aircraft, how tall are they, right? They're like 20 feet tall to get to the door, right? So we call one of our portable stair chairs out, right? So we have a vehicle that brings the stairs for us. We're not going to throw a 35-foot ladder to the aircraft. You know, if we have those resources, we need to know they're there to use, right? And then cargo access, and does it have a fire protection system? You know, a lot of aircraft have some type of halon or other type of fire protection system in it. If it's not utilized, there's a problem. Do we know how to manually use it? Do we know what areas it protects, right? Well, that will help us strategically figure out where we need to put our agents, right? If we already have a fire suppression system working somewhere else, maybe some of the other areas or aircraft are higher threat that we need to focus on, right? All right, so just some food for thought. All right, the training aspect. All right, so when we think about aircraft training, so much goes into it, right? But these are just some components that you want to think about in training, okay? Making sure you drill with these things frequently is very important, right? We can't just do this class and expect to remember it 3 years later. We have to go out and practice these things. We have to walk around the aircraft. We have to do that type of thing. So make sure you're participating in some type of scheduled training. Build your aircraft or airport pre-fire plans. Identify shared resources, right? So is there some other agency, organization, something that has a resource that you need? Is someone going to bring you extra AFFF? Can someone bring you a bunch of dirt, you know, to put on a field fire or something, some hazmat spill? You know, can someone bring you a certain type of material or resource? So knowing that's going to be important. And then use of historical data. What do you most commonly run into, right? We all prepare for these aircraft crashes, but I bet you 90% of the stuff I've been to are not crashes. There's some type of other thing, right? Bird strike, engine failure, hot brakes, brake fire, APU fire. There are all these other things, right? We can't just keep going to fires and putting a bunch of water on it. There are other things we need to be prepared for, right? Here's just some examples of reference tools. So obviously in your local area, I would lean on whatever you reference there. Here for the aviation industry, obviously the Federal Aviation Regulation 139.319 is kind of like the Bible regarding that. There's some NFPA, National Fire Protection Association standards that govern ARF response, right? That you need to look at, or sorry, you don't need to look at. It's up to you, right? I'm just giving you examples of resources. And then those other ones down at the bottom, those are specific to United States military reference materials that tell us all the hazards on aircraft. All right. Make sure you're pre-planning special situations, right? We talked about crashes into a structure, right? If you know that's a potential, work with your partners. Hey, if this happens, how are we going to respond? How are we both going to respond to deal with this incident effectively? You know, do you have water issues, access issues, geography issues, right? There's terrain issues. You know, how are you going to deal with something that happens there? All right. All right. So all these components for me, from my experience, definitely help with a collaborative mutual aid response. So some of the things to think about: do you have agreements in place? What are the resources they bring? Is EMS done by the agency or another area? Are there specific hazards? Protective actions, meaning what are the areas that we're going to have to protect with the population? And can you shelter in place and keep people in their houses as an action, or is that not possible? If you tell them to get out, how are they going to do it? You know, they can't just walk out into a cloud of bad stuff. You got to make sure that you know where they're going to go, what routes they're going to take. Do they know how to get there? You know, some things to think about. Decontamination I talked about is huge. So in the planning for this, some focus areas when you're looking at working with partners, I'll just leave this to reference. You will get this PowerPoint. Like Nancy said, it will be on your, I don't know if YouTube or whatever site you're allowed to use, so you can re-reference this. And I'll give Nancy my information. Honestly, you can email me anytime to ask me further questions because I know I'm running out of time here. So standard responsibilities for non-ARF responders. This is what I talked about. So look at this list. What do you want a non-aircraft rescue firefighting trained responder to do? They can't do what you do, but they can do certain things. In the past, what they've done for us is provide personnel, water supply, help with EMS triage, right? If we have a lot of victims, a lot of people that are hurt, hey, you're EMS trained, go do that. So now I don't have to commit my resources to that. I can focus on the aircraft side of the house. So what can they do to help you out to free your resources up to go handle that emergency? So these are some things to think about regarding that. All right. All right, so key components, right? Just to think about pre-fire planning on the airport and aircraft. What training programs, situational awareness, and then for your mutual aid response, what does that look like? So I think I was actually on time today. I went through it pretty quick at the end there, so I apologize.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's the end of the presentation. I appreciate a little bit of time to share with you.
Absolutely. So thank you very much. I know this has been a topic that we've had questions about for a long time. So I'm really grateful to you for sharing on this topic. And let me adjust a few things. So just to conclude and follow up on a couple of things, and then I see a couple more questions in the chat as well. Thank you everyone once again for attending today. We had great attendance today. So that really shows to me not only importance of the topic, but also the rumor is spreading on how great of an instructor we had today. So appreciate that. And also just a couple of things. If you have questions with relationship to the topics that were talked about today, I want to encourage you to post those questions on the Africa Fire Services networking group. So that group is monitored by AFM. We love questions there. Our instructors will answer your questions. And if I monitor that, if I see a question that someone is not responding to, I will get an answer for you from one of our instructors and we will get a response. So please utilize that networking group for asking those questions as well. Again, the training will be posted on our website and linked to our YouTube channel as well. And if you would complete the training evaluation that you can click on here or that you'll receive from us an email after the session, we greatly appreciate it. So with that, we'll formally close the program today. And once again, thanks for coming, everyone.